On today's episode, we're answering the question, no, we're not, because I'm on the wrong damn outline.
First, let's put it in perspective. The six-figure launches, what does it really mean? Because the six-figure launch can mean a lot of different things. It can be the money that they're actually getting in, the sales, the six-figure sales. Let's say $20,000, for example, $20,000. But how much of that people are actually keeping? Because yes, you do get $20,000 in. However, there are expenses such as Facebook ads, for example, which we all know can get super, super expensive. Then you have the copywriter who's actually writing your landing pages. Then you have the staff that you have, for example, a virtual assistant. You might have someone who's handling your Facebook groups. You might have someone who's handling your correspondence, who's helping you in the business. You might have another coach that you have to pay for. So when you're thinking about this, the 5-figure launches, it's not just revenue, it's also the expenses that come into it, and how much is it really, after all of it is deducted, and you still have to think about your taxes as well, how much are you really getting out of it? So it's not just about the sales, it's about the whole financial aspect of it, the whole 360 view, not just the sales.
When people are, this is a follow-up for you. So when people are claiming, I just had a 6-figure launch, are they saying that they had a net revenue of 6 figures, or is this like gross revenue? What's the right way that people should be talking about this? Because it feels sometimes a little misleading.
Yeah, and you're right. It usually means the revenue that people are bringing in. That's what it means.
Okay.
It's not gross revenue. It's not net profit. It is the revenue that's coming in.
Okay, fair enough. And for people who may not completely understand, because, I'm not going to judge people's financial literacy, tell us the difference between net and gross.
So when you think about it, the number that you're bringing in, let's say $20,000, and the difference between that and all the expenses that you have to support this number are what you brought in and the expenses, and then there's the net. So you brought in 20,000, you spend 19,500, you make $500, and that's your net.
So to clarify, the 20,000 would be our gross, because #writer for a reason here. The 20,000 top revenue would be our gross. And then after all the expenses and all the payouts, that $500 is what we net. Is that right?
No, the 20,000 would be your actual revenue. The gross is the way how you look at the expenses. If you have the expenses there, for example, that you're supporting that particular, so for example, a copywriter, that would be your gross expense. So the gross profit would be the 20,000 minus the copywriting. That would be your gross particular, profit. And then you take the additional expenses to get to your net expense. It's just how you classify expenses. But the best way to look at it is you brought 20,000 in, you had all of these expenses in between, whether they're gross or whether you're operational expenses, your net was $500. Hope that clarifies.
Okay.
No, it does. It does. It totally
did. Thank you. I was unmuting. Should we be focused on that 6 or 7 figure income? I mean, what number should we be focused on here to try and hit?
Yeah, the best answer for that would be your net. What is your net profit after everything is said and done? And the other piece is also cash as well, because that comes into play if you are offering payment options. So for example, someone can pay you, let's say $5,000. However, because for the particular customer clientele that you are servicing, you might be offering payment options. And that's very common. And say, well, I'm going to offer this in 2 installments, $2,500 now and $2,500, let's say, in 3 months. So think about also, when are you going to be getting that cash? Because your expenses, you might have to pay them now, but your cash is going to come later. So think about not just in terms of the profit, how much you're making, but also when are you going to be getting that cash?
There's a whole lot to take into consideration when we're trying to do a larger launch. And for the uninitiated, or for people who have done it, maybe not successfully, it didn't go really well, what are we missing in our planning and in what we're doing with our launches that we should be looking at instead? I feel like people sometimes are focusing on the wrong thing, and I'd love to hear what we actually should be focusing on.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think the best way to really look at it is put it in a spreadsheet. It doesn't have to be complicated, but if you put it in a spreadsheet first before you start spending money, you're really going to see how much you plan on getting the money in, and then all the expenses they're coming through, and that will give you a good indication whether you need to tweak your expenses because you're not going to be hitting your profitability like we said before, or you might actually find out that by doing this launch, even though it's super exciting because of all the expenses and everything that you're going to have to put out, it doesn't really make financial sense for you to do it right now at this moment. It doesn't mean that it's never going to be a good time to do it, but right now at this moment, it might not be a good time. So putting that on the spreadsheet and actually planning it out before it happens, it also gives you a good indication whether you should be going down that route, or if there's any ditches that you might fall into, right? And it's a good exercise to do.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we see people that are like, okay, I'm going to do this. And then, they're going to do, let's say, a summit, because I have done one recently and Jenny does a bunch of them. And they think, okay, so I need to get Zoom professional so I can record my things. And that's this much a month. And then I might need a page builder. So that's this much a month. And they don't think about things like copy, video editing, hosting, ads, but they just kind of pay for it as it comes up, which then it just doesn't allow them to really project very well. So how would you suggest, would you really just think about sitting down and brainstorming all the potential things you might need and figuring out costs for those? Is that what you would do?
Yeah, you're right. Especially if this is your first launch, because if you've done 2, 3, or more than that, you already know all the little details that the expenses just creep up that you wouldn't even think, editing, video editing, copy, you have to update your website, all these little things that just add up. And if you don't have someone in your business that's doing this full time, that's a part of their job, you're going to have to outsource it out. You have to get a freelancer or whoever's that you're going to be getting. And of course you have to pay them. It's a lot easier when you have already, a full-time employee or a part-time employee that's already doing that. So you don't have to think about those smaller nuances. But if this is your first thing and you've never done this before, really think about it, walk through the steps of what is it that I'm going to do. It's almost like you have to do a workflow before and then put a number on each of the steps of that particular step in the workflow, right? So if this is your first time, go through all the particular steps, brainstorm it, put it on a spreadsheet, and plan it out. How much do you think it's going to cost? Also, the good thing for that is as well, because it's going to give you the guardrails. Once you're in the middle of it, it is very exciting to see the money coming in and, oh, if I spend a little more, I'm going to get this out. No, if you have it on a spreadsheet, you have it planned out, so you know that you're going to be spending, let's say, $1,500 on a copywriter and not a penny more. And that way, you know that you have the guardrails for that particular expense, and you're not going to be left with, $500 at the end of the day in your pocket by doing all this work.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people will fall into that trap. I have another question I want to ask you, and it's a little off the cuff here, but what else are we missing to make sure that our next launch is actually financially successful? You were mentioning some steps previously. What steps do we have to take to make sure that we're not missing anything at all?
Yeah, the steps would really be looking through the entire launch. So not just looking at it in like we were right now discussing, what are some of the steps that you have in particular launch in terms of expenses, or what needs to happen in the workflow, but also think about your business in 3 ways. How does it look like before the launch? What are some of the expenses and the streams of revenue that you're having right now, and how are you supporting that? Also, during the launch we just talked about, and then think about your business after the launch. How is it going to look like? Because you're going to bring all of these people in, all of these customers in. Great, they're giving you their money. Now you have to support them. Now it comes to customer support. And it might be that the people that you have right now, just for example, if it's just you, it might be that you're at capacity. You're going to have to hire more people. You're going to have to hire more coaches. You're going to have to hire more assistants to help you with it. So that's going to be another expense that you have to account for to get you the support. Also, the other piece is to how is it going to look like operationally? Do you have to put new systems in place because your particular website or your particular whatever you're using to support this group, if you have a group, that's software you're using right now, it's not really good in support of all these new customers that you're bringing in. So you might have to switch a provider, and that's going to be another expense. So think about it in those ways of not just expenses during the launch and what needs to happen during the launch, but also what needs to happen after the launch to support that volume that you just brought in.
I really like that. And I'm experiencing that now. So at the time of this recording, I have recently completed a summit. I've been doing a lot, and we'll call that a launch because that's exactly what that is. Well, now I'm more slammed than ever with copy work. And so now I need to hire someone to help fulfill this in my own business. So that's an expense I didn't think about when I planned out that launch.
Yeah.
That's what you're talking about, right?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
So how do you keep on track in the middle of your launch? If you're like me, right, you get excited about that stuff. So how do you keep on track instead of going for the stuff? I know you said if it's on the spreadsheet, you don't do, if it's not on the spreadsheet, you don't do it, but how do you keep yourself from doing it anyway?
And this is where it gets easier when you have help, because if that is not something that you enjoy, and let's be real, most people do not like spreadsheet work, you can have someone help you. You can have an assistant help you. You might be able to have your bookkeeper help you with it as well. Someone that is tracking all these expenses, because just because you have it in a spreadsheet, it doesn't mean that it's going to happen. You have to be accountable to that particular number. And that means that you're going to have to track it. You're going to have to track all the revenue that comes in, all the expenses that you're putting in. And that's a lot of extra work on you, especially if, you're the one that's really driving this particular launch. So really do think about, do I need to get a help from someone to help me keep track of all these numbers? Because when you're busy, you might just say, well, I just forget it, I'm not going to do it. And that's when you can really fall into, because if you're not tracking it, you can easily run over those numbers. And then all this exercise that you've done to help you get into that particular profit number that you wanted to, the guardrails that you put together, you're just ignoring them because you can't track it. So that is a very practical thing to do. Don't just put it in a spreadsheet, but also track it.
You're talking about guardrails. If we're brand spanking new and we can't, or even if we're further along and it's our first launch and we have never had to project our finances, how are we going to understand the guardrails, but also how are we going to understand every particular thing that we need to do when we've never done it before?
And that's a great question. The best way to do this is if you talk to other people who have gone through it before. If you have friends, or if you're in a community, if you have like a network community where people have done these particular launches, Facebook groups are very helpful with that. Have a conversation with a couple of people who have gone through it, who are a little more steps ahead than you, and ask them.
On today's episode, we're answering the question,